going on, everyone? It's Nina Infinity. Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about some cringe stuff, infinite cringe that is. This is really funny. It's woke on woke crime, and I always get a bit of a laugh when I see woke on woke crime happen. It's funny to me, and I think it should be shared with the rest of the world. Now, this one is going to be about the New York Times. New York Times has been taking a lot of L's recently. Most recently, I saw this right here: to prevent robberies, quote, "We are putting out a clear call to all our shops. Do not allow people to enter the store without taking off their face mask," end quote, Mayor Eric Adams of New York City said. So this is a New York Times article. They've been getting ratioed. There's Zuby here, how things have changed. It's pretty interesting because clearly things have been changing with regards to the COVID narrative, and a lot of people are changing their tune. But that's not what we're going to focus on today, because something even more funny popped up. This was just the start of the L's, recent L's for the New York Times. What caught my eye even more is this civil war that seems to be going on in the New York Times currently, and I'm here for it. So this is the article right here from the Daily Mail, of all places. The Daily Mail is covering this: how the most right on paper in America is being torn apart by a trans bro. Senior journalists at the New York Times have been harassed and threatened by an unholy alliance of woke celebrities and their own younger colleagues, but they refuse to cave in. We're going to go through this article because it is very interesting. So it starts: the imposing headquarters of the New York Times was built of glass, supposedly to highlight the fact that the August newspaper has nothing to hide. But last month, something happened there that the management would have very much preferred to go unnoticed. Well, it didn't go unnoticed, and that's funny. And that's why I'm going to signal boost it even more, because I think people should know about this. It's funny. An electronic billboard lorry parked outside the building bearing the message, "Dear New York Times, stop questioning trans people's right to exist and access medical care," is the issue at hand right here. This is the picture of it. It says, "Join the 100+ organizations and leaders calling on the New York Times to change," at glad.org/New York Times. The article goes on: the stunt was part of a campaign against America's biggest newspaper to force it to stop criticizing the transgender movement, and specifically the controversial medical treatments offered to some children wanting to change their gender. What makes it so embarrassing for the 172-year-old newspaper, the Bible of the city's liberal elite, and nicknamed the Gray Lady for its dour, somber-minded reputation, is that huge numbers of its staff and contributors actually support the campaign being waged against it. Woo-hoo-hoo! Shocker! Shocker that some of the people at the head of New York Times are not very happy at the way things are going. The article goes on: indeed, it is no exaggeration to say that the trans debate appears to be tearing the paper apart, as senior, more experienced staff insists on reporting the growing concerns among scientists, doctors, and parents about the effects of transgender treatment, especially on children, while younger woke employees are furious at what they see as an attack on trans movement they wholeheartedly support. The trouble, simmering for some time, burst into the open a few days ago, but more than 180 contributors to the New York Times signed a letter to the paper's management editors for standards, accusing it of fomenting bigotry and pseudoscience. It's pseudoscience now, guys. Whenever they don't agree with something that science is bringing up, like, I don't know, like biology, it's pseudoscience. But whenever it's like, oh, you gotta wear that mask on your face, even though we, like, aren't doing any studies to prove the conclusive results, blah blah blah. No, you wear that you wear that mask because it's science. Right now, you wear it, or you're wrong things. You stop it, or you're gonna be canceled, killing grandmas. But we go on. The newspaper was following the lead of far-right hate groups. They added in what they claimed was excessive and biased coverage of transgender issues. Signatories to the letter, which controversially named and shamed specific journalists, includes famous names such as Sex and the City actress Cynthia Nixon. That's Miranda, for those of you who may not be familiar with the actress, but are familiar with the show. Miranda's the redheaded one with the short hair. She was kind of like always my least favorite character. Moving on. Write-in actress Lena Dunham. Oof, Lena Dunham. And man, one of the most woke celebrities out there, writers, whatever you want to call it. If you guys don't remember who Lena Dunham is, this is Lena Dunham. That's Lena Dunham. She's also the lady that had this super cringe take, which was interesting. When I go, I want my casket to be driven through the NYC Pride Parade with a plaque that reads, "She wasn't for everyone, but she was for us. Who can arrange?" Wow, that's really cringe. So anyways, that's her. Then the article goes on, and the U.S. intelligence whistleblower Chelsea Manning, herself a trans woman who was jailed after leaking hundreds of thousands of secret files about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I always had a soft spot for Chelsea Manning because of what she went through. You don't come out unscathed after going to Guantanamo Bay, if you know what I mean. This virtuous army of self-described thinkers accused the newspaper of publishing irresponsible misinformation about trans people. Articles they singled out for censure included one last June headline that battled over gender therapy, which they said uncritically used the term patient zero to refer to a child in the Netherlands who was one of the first to have transgender treatment. This phrase vilifies transness as a disease to be feared, asserted the complainants. They also attacked feature headline that students change gender identity and parents don't know, which they said fails to make clear that court cases brought by parents who want schools to out their trans children are part of a legal strategy pursued by anti-trans hate groups. These groups, they went on, regard trans people as an existential threat to society and seek to replace the American public education system with Christian homeschooling. But they claimed New York Times readers were never told that. With regards to the Christian homeschooling, now I don't know about the Christian part, but I've been for the homeschooling part for a long time, and not just because of the trans issues. I was mostly about it actually because of what was going on with the schools during lockdown and masking and things like that. I didn't even get into the trans agenda until a lot later, but I digress. The protest letter also mentioned 3 articles that last year were cited by Arkansas Attorney General in support of the new law in Republican-controlled state, which would make it a felony, punishable by up to 10 years imprisonment for any medical provider to administer certain gender-affirming medical care to minors, including puberty blockers that diverge from their sex assigned at birth. The signatories of the letter compared the newspaper's transgender reporting with what they described as its demolishing of queers in the 1960s and 70s and its alleged hounding of homosexuals when the AIDS crisis broke out in the 1980s. Now, interestingly enough, if you read the book, The Real Dr. Anthony Fauci, you will know who was the one responsible for making this happen. Yeah, that guy. And you know what else is interesting is the fact that Fauci is God to most of these people with regards to the COVID agenda. So it's very interesting that some of the same players are active in this era as well. One of the letter's organizers, British writer Joe Levinson, has even speculated that the paper's coverage is being masterminded by transphobes up in the organizations primarily to increase readership. Stop the presses, everybody. Stop the presses. The New York Times has realized that their readers and other people want accurate information when it comes to certain individual groups, and stop the presses. The New York Times wants to make money and get more readers. Holy shit. That is insane, because it's not like the New York Times is a business or anything and needs to keep going by creating more revenue and readership. Wow, freaking shocker. Absolutely blows my mind. The diatribe was coordinated with a separate letter written by trans advocacy groups and backed by more than 100 organizers, which accused the New York Times of spreading inaccurate and harmful misinformation about transgender people and issues. The great irony in all of this is that the New York Times prides itself on being one of the most progressive newspapers in America. It yields to nobody in its liberal values and sanctimonious self-regard. This is why this is considered woke on woke crime, and it's hilarious. For good measure, critics have drawn attention to its appetite for making deranged attacks on Britain and its institutions, portraying them as irredeemably racist. It is forever spelling out the supposed evils of the empire. Little more than 2 hours after the death of the Queen last year, for instance, it ran a piece by Harvard professor Maya Jasanoff urging readers not to romanticize her era because the Queen allegedly helped obscure a bloody history of decolonization whose proportions and legacies have yet to be adequately acknowledged. But what cannot be obscured any longer is the scale of the revolt at the Grey Lady. Feelings are so high that a few days ago, the paper admitted one of its journalists was spat on near their home by someone who was incensed by the New York Times trans coverage. The newspaper's executive editor, Joe Kahn, has tried to quell the anger on both sides inside the paper, emailing staff to demand that they stop publicly attacking each other. That's insane. That's insane. We're talking about educated people that work at the New York Times. Educated people. This is not just every other person. These are... He insisted the articles on trans issues that had offended critics were deeply reported and sensitively written, yet the journalists who produced these stories nonetheless have endured months of attack, harassment, and threats on social media. And in an apparent show of defiance that has left the paper's critics even more livid, a day after the protest letters were sent, the New York Times published an opinion piece defending JK Rowling against accusations that she was a transphobe. That's kind of based, I'm not gonna lie. Columnist Pamela Paul wrote, "This campaign against Rowling is as dangerous as it is absurd. The brutal stabbing of Salman Rushdie last summer is a forceful reminder of what can happen when writers are demonized." And this is such a great point because, as some of you may know, I was born in Iran and I immigrated to Canada. So I'm very familiar with the idea of censorship, especially the censorship of media by the government to spin government propaganda. Now, in places like Iran and North Korea and other places, if you are a journalist and you go against the grain, most of the time you are killed. So their resolution to questions and wrong thing are a lot more severe, but it doesn't get to that point if you don't follow steps 1 through 10. You don't go from 0 to 100 all of a sudden. This is the process of getting to that place, and the American people are letting it happen. So when you have people like Salman Rushdie being attacked, when you have journalists being attacked, it's a very, very bad thing. Just earlier today, or yesterday, I think it was, Chuck Schumer came out and called out Tucker Carlson about the January 6th reporting and everything like that. Now, mind you, those guys aren't quite on the same side, and the Fox News is not quite woke, so it's not really woke on woke crime. But what I'm trying to say is the idea of censoring media and censoring journalists and censoring information that's coming out, the government asking for censorship is against everything that the people of America believe in. The idea of free speech, the idea of freedom of religion, the idea of being able to express yourself and talk about whatever it is that you want to talk about, the idea of open discourse. And now it's all being shut down slowly, and even now with their own liberal agenda like the New York Times. And that's quite interesting to observe and quite concerning. So the article goes on, as the Harry Potter author knows only too well, it takes guts to take on the trans lobby. You can't say that again. To a certain degree, the trans furor at the New York Times mirrors what has happened at Britain's most famously liberal newspaper, The Guardian. Oh, that's right. The Guardian went through something similar. In 2020, more than 300 Guardian staff signed a letter of complaint over a pattern of publishing transphobe content at the paper. Guardian's columnist Susan Moore subsequently left the paper, saying that she had been bullied out by colleagues because of her views on sex and gender. Other female writers have followed suit, including fellow columnist Hadley Freeman, complaining about the erasure of women's rights and the paper's censoring of any views that conflict with those of transgender lobby. But in contrast to The Guardian, which Freeman alleged no longer prepared to countenance publishing articles that questioned trans ideology, the New York Times has recently insisted on doing so. After initially welcoming the transgender movement, portraying its critics as bigots, the New York Times became more skeptical as questions mounted. Maybe they shouldn't have done that to begin with. Maybe they should have been skeptical from the very beginning. In November last year, it published an investigation into the puberty blockers drug administered to children as young as 9 in the US were transitioning. The investigation showed that these drugs are anything but risk-free, citing studies that showed significant link to osteoporosis. It's increasingly clear that the drugs are associated with deficits in the bone development. And it was this kind of coverage addressing both sides of the argument that precipitated the extraordinary civil war now taking place at the New York Times. The divide at the New York Times is generally one of age, just as it was in 2020 when the furious outcry by young staff scared management into pushing out a comment section editor who had run a piece by a Republican senator calling for Army to sort out persistent rioting by some supporters of the Black Lives Matter movement. 2 weeks ago, the old guard hit back in the form of dozens of New York Times journalists, including some of its more senior reporters, signing another letter, this time attacking their staff union, which has supported those criticizing the paper's trans coverage. We ask that our union workers do to advance, not erode, our journalistic independence, they wrote sternly. Our duty is to be independent. We pursue the facts wherever they may lead. We are journalists, not activists. The line should be clear. I wish this was the case. I wish this had been the case when it came to COVID and a lot of other things, but the New York Times has taken a very biased stand, a very, very biased and liberal stand for a very long time. And this just does not ring true and seems disingenuous for the most part. But maybe, hey, like, you know what they say, get woke, go broke. Maybe they are really starting to get hit in the pocketbooks, and maybe they're starting to realize, hey, you know, this kind of stuff is starting to get out of hand, and maybe we should actually start practicing journalism. Of course, some may point out that this huffing and puffing over journalistic excellence and tireless pursuits of the truth is somewhat laughable from a newspaper whose pejorative coverage of British life has at times been very far from accurate or fair. I just literally said the same thing, but not just about British life, but about everything else that the New York Times covers most of the time. But the outcome of this acrimonious battle over trans issues at the Grey Lady between the experienced hands and woke millennials succeeding them could have profound ramifications for the culture war that is causing such division on both sides of the Atlantic. Woo! What a crazy article. That's very interesting. And as always, you know, we talk about this constantly. Get woke, go broke. And this entire BS woke agenda is definitely something to behold. And the fact that some people are starting to be really, really waking up to it is definitely an interesting sign of the times. If you liked the video, please make sure you smash the like, share it with everyone you know, and support the channel by subscribing or checking out my merch store. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much. Make sure you comment down below with your thoughts, and I will see you next time. Have a good one, everybody. Bye.